Hello everybody. As usual, I'm doing my recordings pretty much on Saturday mornings now, or Saturday as I get some tasks done. I may float into the afternoon, but yeah, I'm gonna try to be consistent in getting out some stuff. So primarily now, as you know, like I'm wanting to focus on full albums, at least once a month, and then I go and do a lot of research into those albums, and then I'm going to be doing basically your requests throughout the weeks, and just so compile those into a nice long video that I'm going to do today. So I'm going to just show my gratitude with your requests, and I kind of dig in. I'm going to dig into those requests and take a quick listen. They're mostly pretty much brand new listens, fresh listens. I maybe go through the album and just sort of needle drop on a few songs to find the selection to do, or the couple selections. I haven't been doing one, but I might just do a couple, if it feels right to do. So, and you guys give me some great stuff, and I look forward to. I know there's a few things from stuff you guys have given me, or my retrospective of the Canterbury scene. People are like, "Oh, I've never heard that before," blah blah blah. So, anyway, that's what it's all about. Just to sort of get to everything a little bit faster, having a more expansive search, and finding inspirational material for all of us. So that being said, let's jump into the first one. And I'm going to put this out as a whole video, but I'll also put it out in sections for individual videos, for anybody that wants to take it on that way. This is one, and I'm going to basically play a song, and then I'm going to talk about it a little bit, and then go into it again. So this one is a really interesting one because I'm not sure if somebody recommended this. I feel like somebody did, but I couldn't find their name at the time. Maybe I didn't write it down at the time, and I went back and looked, and I couldn't find it. But this may have popped out because I've been doing, as you know, the Canterbury scene, like a huge retrospective, a small musical retrospective, but a lot of bands. So like 20, it's going upwards of 20 bands from 63 to 75, and I think I may go beyond that a little bit. And then that's going to be probably a couple full albums out of that, out of the really ones that have really hit the spot. So, but I think in searching through that, I think I did find this group, and it's not technically in the Canterbury scene, but was on the outskirts and was meeting a lot of the people, all the players, musicians at the time in London. So that is the Chris McGregor Brotherhood of Breath. If you mention this to me at some point in the past, please put something down in the comments for that, so I can give you the credit for that, because I really appreciate it. These guys are very interesting. Anyway, these guys came to London in the late 60s, met a lot of the musicians, so they are related. They used some of the members of this group ended up being on Centipede, one of my recent videos in the Canterbury scene with Keith Tippett put together, very large group of players and horn players. So you had Mark Schurig and Nick Evans on this album with Chris McGregor's Brotherhood of Breath. So they're part of the Keith Tippett sextet. So vice versa, they kind of switched players and kind of intermingled a good bit there. So these guys definitely have a spot. And so I'm not sure who recommended this, but if you did, let me know. If not, then these guys were just a lucky find for me. And like I said, there's always gems in there, so you gotta be open that what you found so far is not the bottom of the well. There's always more there, and sometimes a lot of it's maybe a little bit, you gotta dig a little deeper to find the good stuff. Maybe you have found most of the good stuff, and so it takes a lot longer now to find those gems, but they are there, and I find every day I go looking, there's something there that I'm just like surprised that I didn't find before, and there still could be one that's the ultimate, just as good as anything you've heard before. McDonald and Giles, this group, Keith Tippett, all that stuff, all kind of intermingles of progressive rock and the Canterbury scene, and just good music, that for whatever reason, that's the thing. It's not the survival of the fittest in this music, right? Sometimes things happen, music doesn't get put out there. There's not an audience at the time. Maybe the audience is there. Maybe they were ahead of their time. You just never know why stuff gets buried. Anyway, let's get to it. So, Chris McGregor, Brotherhood of Breath. Musicians. Chris McGregor on leader of the group, start of the group, with a couple other guys on piano and African xylophone. Dudu Pukwata, alto saxophone. Mike Osborne, alto sax, clarinet, flute. Ronnie Beer on tenor sax and flute. Alan Skidmore on tenor sax, soprano sax. John Sermon on baritone sax and soprano sax. Harry Beckett on trumpet. Mongezi Feza on trumpet and flute. Mark Sherrig, cornet. Malcolm Griffiths on trombone. Nick Evans on trombone. Harry Miller on bass. And Louis Maholo on drums and percussion. Chris McGregor, Brotherhood of Breath, and we're going to do a couple tunes. But first we're going to start off with their first song on the CD, which is called MRA. So yeah, that was so exuberant. That was so lovely. It was. I love the production, the right and left, the separation of the horns, as well as obviously the arrangement with the horns. It sounded like you had 3 or 4 different. It kind of reminds me of like, you have the centerpiece and you have these 4 different entities sort of intermingling and playing together, almost like birds kind of like fluttering around a flower, and taking turns, and one jumping in to get something and the other one jumping in to do it, the way they interplayed. But it was so obviously the rhythmically on point, rhythmically very synchronous in the way that they sort of interplayed there. So very good arrangement, as far as creating that sort of spontaneous feel to it. It sounded very, very spontaneous, but obviously it was very well, orchestrated and arranged, and played sort of, effectively. And that's the thing. Sometimes they make it look easy, most players, when they make it look easy, like they're just having fun. I think the first time I heard jazz, it just sounded to me like pure play. It sounded easy. I was like, oh, that sounds so easy, what they're doing there. It just sounds like they're just, off the top of their head, and it's all playful. It's just fun. But obviously there's a lot of education, a lot of practice, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that goes into that. In the Keith Tippett group, so this was recorded, debut album by South African pianist and composer Chris McGregor's big band of the same name. They worked together prior to this and had different band names, so it wasn't the debut album necessarily. The group had been together for a while, for years. But the beginnings of this particular iteration of the players was called, Chris McGregor Brotherhood Breath. Perhaps, like I said, because they were intermingled with some of the musicians in London that they had met when they went over to London. Basically, they were expatriates of South Africa and traveled around, did some gigs around the world in different countries, and some of the players that were on were on this album, including Alan Skidmore, John Sermon, Mongezi Feza, Mark Churig, Nick Evans were also on Centipede, on Keith Tippett's huge, musician album. So on there also you had Dudu Pukawana on Centipede with Alan Skidmore on saxophone, both of them on saxophone. On a cornet you had Mark Churig, Mongezi Feza on trumpet, and then on you also had Nick Evans on trombone, and then you also had, and I believe that might be it as far as the Centipede interaction. So as I said, it's really interesting to see. This was recorded in 1970, so that was before Centipede came out, but it was not before, obviously, Keith Tippett album, and I believe Keith Tippett and his sextet were out. So obviously there was a lot of intermingling of the musicians, and that because of that, they made it in the Centipede, sort of incorporated a lot of these South African musicians into that group. Basically, this album came out in 1971. McGregor stated, you get a feeling for areas you want to explore. It was to do with African polyrhythms. I started hearing the possibility of things happening on a lot of different levels rhythmically. There was a wheel turning then, things flowing together. One author, W.C. Bamberger, described the music as simple, rhythmic, with the parts entering one by one and interlocking, with the sections, line after line, increasing the torque of syncopated complexity until the ear can barely keep up, then backing off and most often starting again. So, as I said, so he initially started, born in Somerset, West South Africa. Chris McGregor became one of his country's most distinguished pianists and opened up the music of South Africa to the world. While attending the Cape Town College of Music, he formed the multiracial Blue Notes, along with the likes of Dudu Pukawana, Mongezi Feza, and Louis Moholo, Nick Moyak, and Johnny Deuni. Together, they won the prestigious Johannesburg Cold Castle Festival in 1962, and then while touring in Europe in 1964, they decided not to return home and settled initially in Switzerland and then London. And then they basically were exiled during the next 25 years. The Blue Notes were given access to the Antibes Jazz Festival in 1965 and given a good reception, if not curious one regarding their style, which was a little new to a lot of people. Another offer facilitated by the compatriot Dollar Brand, or Abdullah Ibrahim, at the Africana Club in Zurich. So they spent the winter in one room in a basement of his student house with occasional monthly gigs. And by April 1965, they were happy to accept a 2-week stint at Ronnie Scott's club in London. But there was just not enough of a scene to sustain them in London, the union rules also forbidding them to take any jobs that could be filled by British musicians for their first year there. Everyone always seemed to be sitting around the teapot, as one of the musicians said. Over the next few years, the musicians went out on their own paths, but always staying connected with the Brotherhood. The union required they wait a year before allowing full access to work, so some of the musicians stayed in London for that period, and then some scattered to other parts of Europe. They basically came back together for this album, some of the musicians, mixed with some of the musicians they had met over the periods, over the years in London. So, as I said, this is in fact Chris McGregor's second band. The first was in 1968, giving a few performances, and Chris McGregor eventually moved to Aquitaine, France in mid-1974, playing mostly solo gigs and often getting the Brotherhood back together for occasional gigs. So yeah, very lucky to find this album. It's really interesting. Yeah, honestly, it's reminiscent. Obviously, there's a lot of different types of, nowadays it's easy to get access to a lot of the... So I appreciate this recommendation. Yeah, as I said, I'm going to do one more. And this one is called, that was the first track on the album, the lead-off track. And it was a really good introduction, just sort of really, really upbeat, fun piece to hear. And actually, so yeah, we're going to do one called the third track on this album, which will be called The Bride. And here we go. Okay, I'm going to pause it just for 1 second. They seem they had a little bit of a, whatever amount of a lull that was. It was not much of a lull, but just to be have a little transition piece on there. So yeah, I'm not sure who that may be. Probably Didu Pukwana on alto saxophone. He may be the main. I know he's one of the original members of the group. But yeah, this fits in very much different, obviously, than that first piece, which had a very like a motif that just kind of a lot of interplay. This one is much more in the sort of, jazz avant-garde, or even, more, a little bit, not necessarily avant-garde, but certainly in this period, the sort of Coltrane long jams, in that period from the late 60s. So yeah, and again, so I was actually just looking at the Centipede. So one significant aspect of Centipede is the participation of the South African musicians, including sax player Dudu Pukwana, trumpet player Mongezi, and Harry Miller, moving from their troubled homeland. So they quickly became influential on the jazz scene in England. Tippett talked about them with great admiration, saying they were the first band I heard in London, and I just couldn't believe my ears. There was Chris McGregor, who was white, and that was one reason why they left South Africa, because they couldn't play together. They did, but you weren't allowed to play together, and you couldn't play to mixed audiences. They suffered their exile with great dignity. Eventually, a year later, we became friends, and they liked my sextet. They all died. They never got home. They never saw Mandela leave prison. They never saw the end of apartheid. They couldn't go and visit their mom or dad because they may not get out again. All very, very sad and shocking when you look back on it. Just shocking. But yeah, that's pretty amazing. Keith Tippett heard them in the early, in that period, when he got to London, and had such a great influence on them. Whereas they didn't have a lot of opportunities in London, really. They were kind of, obviously in the first year they're there, they had very trouble getting gigs because they weren't really allowed to play in the Union very much, until they'd been there for a year. And even then, they're looked at as very much as the, maybe a novelty sort of in that scene, because they weren't quite jazz, they weren't quite, in the British, spectrum. So, I think a lot of areas where they went, they had the same sort of reaction where, it wasn't something they went to London thinking they're gonna, have all this interaction, with all these musicians, and it's just gonna be this glorious, melting pot, and I think a lot of probably that's what Keith Tippett thought as well when he went to London, that he's just gonna immediately just be enveloped with all this music and all this inspiration and creativity, and a lot of times the reality hits everybody, like a brick wall, but it's the sort of tenacity that doesn't necessarily get you to the top, but it gets you in the door perhaps, and that's what they were sort of had that, made some albums, got their music out to the public and to musicians, and eventually out to the public, and now it's 50 plus years later, where are they now in the public sphere, in the public eye? Certainly not in the public eye, but in the musicians, if you look long enough, they're there. You'll find them, and it took me this long just to hear them, in this sort of research and this look, so I appreciate this very much. But let's continue, and we'll finish up with this one song called The Bride. Or I'll go back it up a little bit. Here we go. Enjoy. That was The Bride. Yeah, that was fantastic, and obviously there it's a little reminiscent, you can hear, especially in this time in the 70s when it was, or 1970 when it was recorded. Obviously that time, yeah, just like Keith Tippett his listening was a lot of, Coltrane and Pharoah Sanders. And I definitely, in this playing style and some of this, I definitely heard a little bit of Coltrane and Pharoah Sanders style. So I don't know for sure, but I'd be interested, definitely curious to see how much these musicians, which was a mixed band at this time, mixed with some London musicians. So, I mean, there was, obviously they were sharing music. I'm sure typically, once this is the pathway you're going to group, and all of a sudden you're on the inside of, everything else that the musicians are into, you're also, have a lot more access to. So, your drummer listens to this, sax player listens to this, the bass player is listening to this and pushing this style. You're sort of open, to all that. So you hear all that a little bit more. Your access to that is even wider and more expansive. So for sure, the jazz players of the day that were, being, pushed out there, like Coltrane and Pharoah Sanders and others, into sort of the changing of, in the world, bringing those to the world, especially, Pharoah Sanders, and bringing those sort of, those different rhythms, those world rhythms, to jazz, for sure we're on the spectrum by now. So, it'd be interesting to see. But a great mixed band of, South African and London musicians, as I said. So, I would say, so on the bass on there, the bass was a little, Louis Maholo, loved him on the drums, really pushed that, sounded great, really brought that sort of, modern, at the time, that modern jazz, to the front. It sounded very crispy, very on point, and just, kept that, forward momentum and that style going. Yeah, sounded super good. The bass, it was a little hard to focus in on, it was just, maybe it was the way it was recorded, I think, was just a little flat, or just kind of put it wherever he put it in the mix, or didn't separate it from everything enough, because it was kind of drowned out a little bit, and the tone, wasn't really, you couldn't really hear the separation, couldn't hear the, the notes he was playing, the scales he was moving, or he's moving up, you couldn't hear much of what he was doing. So that was a little bit of a negative. I would have loved to hear the bass also really like bring that momentum and that sort of just bring that to it, because I feel like that was the only thing that was sort of missing. The piano sounded great, was very well, the sound, the timbre of it was great, and it was sort of giving that punchiness, so almost was taking the place of the bass, sort of giving you that, like, the little riff and the motif, constant throughout that. And obviously the horns, where they stand out, they stand out, they don't stand out. The playing was great with everything. Where they stand out from other music probably of the time was where all those orchestrated sections, they sort of brought back the idea of a smaller big band, bringing those sort of punchiness, kind of like where Mingus at the time, was doing. He was one of the ones that was focusing more on that, bringing more of a big band style, keeping that into sort of modern jazz, and bringing that sort of inventiveness, for sure, keeping that inventiveness of the spontaneity and improv, but also doing it within, a little bit larger bands. So obviously, this band had, 13, I think at times they had 15 members, very hard to get gigs and then actually have the money to pay, even give them extra money to eat or, pay rent. So I feel like they probably didn't have, whatever money they were getting for gigs was not nearly enough to even sustain them, in that endeavor, whether it was travel, food, lodging, what you have it. Several pieces, particularly Pukawana's MRA and McGregor's Do It, have the infectious and distinctive township highlife sound, the product of the cross-pollination of jazz and African dance rhythms. A seemingly simple riff-based piece like MRA allows groups members considerable latitude as they improvise against the dominant riffs and develop counter rhythms and melodies seemingly at will. The ragged collective improvisation periodically dissolves into chaos, only to reinvent itself and rise triumphantly from its own wreckage. Yeah, that's a great description of that style and sort of the momentum behind it. So they create this sort of piece that you can kind of riff off, and also develop counter rhythms, also go into sort of as they improvise, and also sort of have that sort of, burn up and then come up like a phoenix, sort of rise again and then restate the rhythm from its own wreckage. It's a great introduction, great description of that song. So, and then lastly, let me see. And as Melody Maker stated at the time when this record came out, was probably the most exciting band of any kind in London at the present. That was said of Chris McGregor. So, yeah, I mean, they certainly had accolades. They certainly were respected. But at the end of the day, it was just not, the size of the band and the style of the music. And for whatever reason, the public's thriving off of it, just were not enough to keep it, keep it going. That being said, that's not, is that the ultimate goal of the group, of music in itself, is to sort of, have sustained growth over time. It's not necessarily every evolution of a style of music. So, but at least, their music is out there. They recorded. They had a lot of interaction with different scenes around the country, around the world. So they had London, they had Switzerland, introduced to different jazz festivals around the world at the time. Certainly had influence, in different areas. So, and you never know where that influence is going to take hold in the future. So anyway, yeah. So I really appreciate the recommendation, or if I just found this by accident looking through the Canterbury scene and just gave it a quick listen, and then but either way, I got a bunch more to get to, so I really appreciate everybody here. Please drop down, keep the recommendations coming, because I'm going to put these out every month. I know it's right near the end of the month right now, so I kind of got this in at the end, because I've been really trying to focused on the Canterbury scene, and then I've got a bunch of different upcoming. I'm not sure if I'm going to even put them as reactions or do them as sort of like little mini documentaries. I really appreciate it, and it's helping me sort of, find stuff just a little bit easier. I like looking now. I'm kind of back in the zone of just exploring more into the music and a lot of different genres. And the Canterbury scene has really helped me find a whole new avenue of music out there, different styles. So it's exciting, and your recommendations help. And so obviously, hopefully you guys get something out of all this new music too as well. Hopefully maybe makes you excited to hear new music again, and find some new inspiration, new reason to go look for things, a new reason to do something. So again, take care, and I will see you in the next one.